So good evening, and hello to everybody. My name is Gabriele Zipf. I'm head of exhibition at Futurium, but don't worry, I won't talk too long. I just want to introduce Pirini Sundaralingam, sorry, our guest today and the host for this event, Rethinking Raw Materials, Design, Brains and the Future. This is a very interesting format because we bring so many different disciplines and perspectives together. And already Perini is the best example for this because she's not only a brain activist, she's also a poet and a museum specialist. So she has been consulting the very famous San Francisco Exploratorium and also Futurium. So happy to have you here. And some words on her academic background. So she's not only the host today, she's also an more or less famous brain scientist and brain activist. She has been educated at Oxford, and she has held science research posts at very famous institutes like the MIT, and led research programs on human resilience at the United Nations and Silicon Valley's Center for Human Technology. She's currently founder and principal at Resilience Consulting, so you will find this also in on the net, and is leading change initiatives for a variety of clients, from startups, NGOs, but also museums, the film industry, and she is utilizing science-based design to catalyze better decision-making and innovation. So sorry for reading this, but it's better to have it in a good formulation. So happy to have you here, and the other guests, you will introduce them yourself. So
I think I have this, so yes. Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Gabby. So I'm so happy to see so many faces here joining us today for what I think will be a very lively conversation. So thank you for joining us this evening. And I'm delighted to welcome to the stage our first panelist, Anna Jona. If you would join me on stage, thank you. So Anna is much traveled. I know that you started life studying literature and history at Tel Aviv University in Israel, and where she met her husband Ran. And then after moving back to Germany in 2013 with your 3 children, that you both noticed that the development of their feet was being affected by the type of restrictive shoes that are typically worn. So as parents, that inspired them to take action themselves. They innovated and took the time to create their very own footwear that supports natural feet movement, so that children can feel, well, all of us now, adults as well, can buy these shoes, so you can feel the ground beneath your feet, quite literally, and encourage people to explore new paths, literally and hopefully metaphorically as well. So we'll be hearing more about that later in the evening. And I'm so fascinated by the company you founded, Wildling. I understand you just did this at the kitchen table. You had this idea, and now you have over 200 employees. And thanks to purely just crowdfunding campaigns. So I'm looking forward to hearing about the journey that you had. And just in the few years since you started this company, you've already won the German Founders Prize in 2021, and also the German Sustainability Award in 2023. So please welcome Anna Jona. So thank you for joining us today. And I'm also delighted to welcome Emma Sika to the stage. And so Emma is a designer working with fermentation and biomaterials. So, and you come originally from an academic background. I know that you, in 2022, you had a master's degree in eco-social design from the Frey University in Bolzano, Italy. And your projects have now been exhibited internationally already. So you've been at the Victoria and Albert Museum in Dundee, at the Futurium, the famous Futurium, the Vitra Design Museum, and you were already honored to be a TEDx speaker. So you can find her online as a TEDx speaker in Bolzano. And now you've started your PhD in design studios, in design studies at FHG Offenbach am Main. So, and I understand that part of your research, you're part of this wonderful, what's called the Cluster of Excellence Matters of Activity here in Berlin, where you've joined with many scientists, engineers, artists, all of you exploring biodiversity in materials, so, and very much through a transdisciplinary approach. So it's wonderful you could join us here today and to join the Futurium exhibition on materials. It's really great to have both of these extraordinary brains here joining us today. So thank you for joining us. And Anna, maybe you could take it off, take us away by telling us a little bit, give us a quick insight into your work.
Happily, thank you. So, yes, I did not found the company by myself. Ran, my husband, was part of it all. He was actually also part of the brain behind it all. That's why I really would like to introduce them. Since we started that, we've been trying to keep all the shoes or the balls in the air, and it hasn't always been easy. Yes, as Prini said, we founded the company because we wanted better shoes for our own kids. They grew up mainly barefoot. And it was really wonderful to see how they would move and how freely, how agile they would move and feel really secure also about the ground beneath their feet. And when we came back to Germany and it was weather such as today, obviously they needed shoes, and it really changed the way they would walk and move. So we tried to find better footwear for them, and we couldn't really find anything that they would like to wear, like no matter how much we took out from the shoes and tried to kind of change it or buy larger shoes so they would have more space. So we decided to make shoes by ourselves, and we kind of thought, okay, how difficult can it be? Like, we had no background in it. We were not designers or product designers or anything, shoemakers. And I think that's kind of where we get back to later, kind of like that questions of how difficult can it be? Like, let's just try. So that took us a bit longer than we thought, and it was a bit more difficult, obviously. But we did end up with a product that is different from what you can otherwise get. And I think that's also because we did not know what we were doing. We were able to think about it in a new way. We did not know what the restrictions were, so we could kind of overcome them. And then the second question was, okay, now we have a running business, we have a running organization. There is some power behind it. How can we actually use it to do things differently, to do things better? And that's when we went much more into the supply chain and into, like, usually when you produce shoes, you go to the supplier and you ask for a certain amount of shoes and a certain design, and the suppliers will take care of all the materials that go into the shoes, and they will buy them. And we wanted to do this by ourselves because we saw that we can really make a difference if we see where we and how we source our materials. Do I still have time for the example?
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
All right. So just one example. This is a beautiful area in Portugal that you can see here. And it's actually being rewilded by the Rewilding Portugal, by Rewilding Europe and Rewilding Portugal in this case. And due to their activities, wolves are coming back into the area. So very obviously the shepherds living there and kind of having a very traditional lifestyle and raising their livestock are not very happy about this. And they start shooting or poisoning the wolves. And the organization was trying to think, okay, what can we do in order to educate these people, in order to gain more understanding, in order also to support and help them, because obviously it's not nice if wolves come into the area and your sheep are being threatened. So in the end, what we did is to partner up with the organization, and we are buying their the shepherd's wool. which is right now not very, I mean, they can't sell it anywhere. So we're buying it. With this, we are supporting them, like we're paying a very fair price for it. And the organization gives them herding dogs to guard their livestock. So with the payment for the wool, they can actually afford the veterinary costs and the additional costs for the dogs, and can protect their herds. And then in the end, we have a material that comes right from the area where we produce, and we have only 150 kilometers all in all, like from the sheep to the ready shoe, and that's like a benefit for everyone in the end, which is what we strive for.
Oh, thank you. Thanks for sharing that fantastic example. It's really, it's very inspiring to think about the shoes we buy, the materials we choose to buy, and how that affects the larger ecosystem. So this idea of thinking beyond just the immediate materials, but the larger materials as well. And I hope we'll talk more about that later. And over to you, Emma. So,
Sorry.
Thanks a lot. Thank you for the warm welcome and the introduction. Thank you so much for being here. I think I will start my presentation by going directly into, isn't it strange that a designer is talking about raw materials, about microorganisms and fermentation? This is kind of pretty unusual. So I'm gonna start by talking about with whom I'm working. I'm working with yeasts that are microorganisms that are very similar to the ones used for making beer and bread, and and bacteria that are similar to the ones used for making vinegar. They are living together in a liquid, and through a symbiotic relationship, they could work to make what here looks a bit like hair, but are fibers of so-called bacterial cellulose. What they do with the bacterial cellulose is like they use it as building blocks to build what is, very similar to what we humans do with buildings. We create our homes to protect ourselves from threats and the outside environment. So this is a nice drawing, and now I want to show you how it looks in real life. It's a sort of jelly, like thick layer of jelly-looking substance. I pass it to you. It's also called SCOBY, symbiotic culture of bacteria and yeasts, and probably some of you already know it because it's used for fermenting tea into kombucha. In other countries, such as Southeast Asia, it is instead fermented with coconut water, and it's consumed as a dessert. But what is very exciting about this biomaterial that you can see passing by is that the cellulose that is contained into the gelatin, it's an alternative source. So instead of having to grow plants and trees, chop them, process them to extract the cellulose, we could just make microorganisms producing it for us. And cellulose is very important because, fibers are used in clothes. We are consuming them because they are very important for our health and the health of our gut microbiome. So it is a very important source that could be threatened by climatic change. What is very exciting about this raw material is that it is possible to feed microorganisms not only with tea and sugar and coconut water, but with many different liquids that can be done with, for example, industrial byproducts. So my research in the past 9 years was trying to understand how to grow it with different liquids, with a perspective of how can this be integrated in situated realities, so in local places around the world. So one part of my research was developing proposals for compostable packaging that can be produced locally. So we have packaging for snacks or for candies, or single-use tableware, even labels. And since the cellulose shall be seen as an ingredient, it can be turned in different states, such as powder, solid foam. For example, it can be a compostable alternative to polystyrene. And these are other examples. And as I was mentioning before, it is possible also to consume it, and it is very important to eat fibers, as the microbiome is considered our second brain, and it is important to take care of it. So these were some proposals of food concepts that I developed by transforming SCOBY in different foods.
And we have some here, yes?
Yeah, we have some here that I can pass by when I finish. So yeah, my focus was on materials, on possible applications, production, and how we can integrate this into systems. At the moment, as mentioned, I'm exploring more how we can explore biodiversity in biomaterials and try to connect traditional knowledge and modern biotechnologies in collaboration with many other professionals. Thank you so much for your attention. And I'm passing by a few samples of materialities.
And Anna, do you have any materials?
Yes, we also have my lovely colleague and friend, Christina, can pass around some shoes, so it's always easier to know what we're talking about when you can feel it.
And Anna, can you tell us what type of materials this is made out of?
Yes, this is a shoe made of 70% paper. It's a paper cellulose. It's also cellulose fiber that is then made into a very special textile.
Yes, and these are outdoor. You can wear the paper shoes outdoors.
You can wear them outdoors.
Fantastic. Thank you. Thank you both for bringing materials to the Futurium. And so as Gabby mentioned when she introduced me, I'm a neuroscientist. I'm particularly interested in problem solving and innovation. So what does it take for our human brains to think differently? Part of what I do, as I did start out life as an academic with my own laboratory, and then as I noticed the world around me, people making very bad decisions and perhaps not maximizing their brain potential, I felt that my contribution could be to try to help people optimize their brain potential, because we all get stuck within certain we have certain blind spots, even as experts. So you can imagine that it's like if you imagine a landscape in which a cart or a wagon is going, if it always takes the same route, gradually that path gets very marked out. And in the same way, for us, if we are experts, we have a particular way of thinking, always in the same way. It's very difficult for us to then innovate and think differently, even though the landscape may be shouting at us to make change. So I'm trying to use what I know as a neuroscientist as to why the brain gets stuck, to help all kinds of different people and organizations work with their brains, using the science, work with their brains instead of against it. Because what we see is this kind of cognitive rigidity sets up, and I talk about a kind of cognitive arthritis. So people become more and more rigid in the way they think, partly as they age, partly as they become more used to staying in one kind of job. And as scientists, we have all kinds of different ways of testing creativity. I'll share a quick slide. A typical experiment, we might give people a range of, you can see these items, and the question is, if you are given a candle, some matches, and a box of tax pins, how can you make a way that the candle is being held up next to the wall? How will you manage that? That's the engineering problem. And most people try to melt the candle and stick it to the wall, or how do you manage? So it turns out, so this is what we ask as a test in experiments, and we see how people can think differently. And it turns out there's all kinds of interesting ways to make people think differently and solve engineering problems such as this. Partly it's to do with sometimes being in a new culture, or being surprised by things, or being playful. Sometimes it's to do with what food substances you eat. So there's all kinds of ways of tilting the brain into being more creative and more innovative. And for those of you who are curious as to what is the answer for this particular test, how do you attach a candle to a wall? This was what you do is you take the pins out of the pin box, and then you melt some wax, and you use the pins to hold the box in place, and then you put the candles in. So that's a little bit about what I do, and I can't wait to get started on this conversation. So yeah, so I'm so glad that the Futurium has invited all of us here today. So I guess I would love to start by asking about what kind of experiences led both of you into basically thinking differently? How did your brains start out? Maybe did you have particular aha moments when suddenly, like Archimedes, you jumped out of the bathtub and you said, I have the idea? Or did you have good teachers at school? What inspired you both?
You want to go first, Emma?
Yeah, I think the very first experience that I can remember of trying to think differently or trying to do the best of what I had was through what is in German called basteln. Basteln is a sort of like do-it-yourself activities that you do, especially with kids. And it's about like doing some creative, building up stuff or making artistic outcomes. And this really trains your brain to also see objects and things in different ways. For example, you can take a potato, cut it with a shape, and then use it to stamp colored figures on whatever you want, hopefully not the walls of your home. Besides that, which is more of a kind of funny anecdotal thing, I would say for me, my education really helped me in my I would say plasticity, which is the contrary of rigidity, if I'm right. Yeah. Because the focus in my education in design in Bolzano was to focus first on the meaning of words and to create a research question. A research question is super hard to put together, and even in my PhD, I have to change it multiple times in the course of now 2 years something. So yeah, for example, the meaning of terms really changes. I remember in my first project, I had to analyze the term geography, and I was asking myself, what could be geography? And even, for example, a body could be geography, or a fruit could be geography. It can tell you with very specific details about climate change, about the soil, there are so many information. So it's very interesting to challenge your understanding of specific terms.
That's interesting, because I think that when we look at the power of language, it's what is can open our minds but also trap us. And we've had traditionally this idea of dividing the world into life and not life. And not life we treat like waste. And both of you think so much about this, right? We treat it as trash, rubbish, waste, the products, and then that means we don't need to look at it, we don't think about it, right? We don't think about the life that's going to grow from that or how it impacts life, right? So this issue of language is critical, right? And being able to be flexible with language.
Yes, for me, I think it was really the experience of traveling. I mean, after school, I started traveling, and I was supposed to study, and then I just came home to say, okay, no, I have to make more money in order to go traveling again, and then again and again. And like what that kind of taught me was two things. One is to really go with the flow, because I mean, traveling, you don't really know what's going to happen next. And to really, I was quite anxious before that. Like even when I had to go to Cologne with a train, I would, get up 20 minutes before my stop, because I thought, okay, I need to get off the train. So like to really ease into that idea of, okay, things are going to happen, things are going to come my way or not my way, and I will find a way to deal with it. So that was kind of like a new calmness about things that may happen. But the other like very strong feeling was that you meet people and they see the world differently. And suddenly you understand that there's a completely different way of looking at something that you've always felt like this is the truth. And that there are many ways of looking at things and many truths. And that was really like, it was both unsettling, because I thought, okay, and I thought that was the way it is, and it's not. And on the other hand, also very freeing of like, okay, like there are so many, you can take a thing and then you can walk around it and can look at it from all the different sides. And yeah, it just opens up.
Is there a particular example that you can think of that you were so surprised as a German woman traveling in another country?
It was more political.
Okay.
Like it was kind of the political landscape that I grew up in and the way that I perceive the world and who are the players in this world and what is their role. For example, the States. And then I was a long time in Latin America. And obviously from that perspective, suddenly things change. And there's that player plays a different role in your country's history and everything. And that kind of really shook my ground. And also to see that, the way our media portray things, it's still, it is not the truth. It is one truth or one way of seeing it, but it's not the whole picture.
Yeah.
So
I wonder if your background in journalism then also helped you kind of think differently in different perspectives. But speaking about being in other countries and cultures, I know, Emma, you've done a lot of work in the field in other countries, right? Could you tell us a little bit about that? Because you're investigating how other systems of knowledge, so how other cultures might be thinking about materials. Yeah.
I think what makes my soul sing is that the experience in the field really makes you experience how much we are interconnected in very relational systems. And it's very different from working in the lab, in which you are a bit isolated as the microorganisms you work with. In the field, everything is very mixed up, everything is intersecting with so many factors, and it's a lot of complexity. The reasons why I ended up in the fields in this specific fields were always in a way connected to people. I made a field visit in Crete, because in my current microbiology research group, we are researching how specific medicinal plants have effects on microorganisms and how these interactions can help humans in helping themselves to promote their health. A sort of kind of DIY approach also to integrate traditional knowledge in everyday practices. And then Thailand was because there is a very specific technique that allows you to make basically the SCOBY from scratch, so to say. So to kind of collect the microorganisms from the wild and explore what they can do. I mean, I understand it's a bit complex because I'm very much into the topic. But what is very important about the field is also positioning yourself. And one of my main concerns when I decided to go to Thailand, because I had this two artisans, an Italian Thai family. So the question was okay, me as an Italian white European woman going to Thailand, which is in Southeast Asia, and trying to do research there, trying to understand all the bureaucracy, everything you can do and cannot do, and also especially really create a relation with the artisans. So for me it was very important to be very clear about what was my interest, why I wanted to go there, negotiate in advance, how to make sure that they feel respected, and let them know in which ways I would use their knowledge. And also, every time I would use their knowledge, I would ask them first, showing the contents, and they have always the right to tell me, I'm not happy with this, take this off, or don't use it, and so on and so forth. Also, it is very important to know that for people wanting to do work in the fields, like for research purposes, there are some agreements that are international, like the Nagoya Protocol, that tells, for example, that you cannot take any sample, any piece of anything, any product that is aimed at research with you without undergoing a very long list of bureaucracy. And I think this is especially to protect the knowledge and to avoid, I would say, inappropriate uses and exploitation and extractivism.
Right.
So,
right. Yeah, and it's interesting that both of you have been working in other cultures, using that to stimulate your own rethinking process. And it reminds me of an experiment that we that has been done, and because there is a whole field called the neuroscience of creativity, really trying to investigate what are some of the best things that you can do for your brain. And yes, traveling or going to another culture will open up the brain, but it's not just traveling there. The scientists found that if you go and they looked at people who traveled to another country. In this case, they looked at Americans who had gone abroad and studied abroad in China for a year and then came back to America. And those who went to China came back, but didn't really integrate into Chinese culture, didn't challenge themselves, stayed in a particular way. Those who went to China and really used it to challenge themselves, even to question themselves, in this case as Americans, that second group, when they were tested in the laboratory, everybody was given engineering problems. Okay, so they're trying to solve the engineering problems. If they were reminded of the time they had spent in China when they were forced to rethink assumptions, then that prompt, just 5 minutes thinking about, oh yes, and in this case it was do you remember that you had to use chopsticks and how you felt it was so difficult and unusual? So just being reminded of a time when you were not an expert, but you were challenged, that was enough that here in the laboratory, in the experiments in America, suddenly they were able to solve these engineering problems in a radically different way. So it's the same brain, but there was a juiciness, kind of like a brain lubrication that happened by being stimulated to think about a time when they were challenged. So it wasn't enough to have traveled to China. That group who just went and didn't think anything about it, it made no difference to them. But those who had been challenged, even years later, that could be a little bit like brain juice to stimulate their thinking. So it seems like both of you automatically, naturally discovered this reality without scientists peering at your brains, but you seem to have naturally done that. I'm curious about, so when you travel, are there tips or strategies that you have that when you look at an object? Well, let's just take when you're at home. Do you look at objects differently, or how can we? It's so easy to look at a glass and just say, "Oh, it's a glass." I mean, how can you think differently? How do you see materials differently?
Do you want to go? Or?
I can start.
Yeah.
Okay, sure. Well, first of all, I can really see this in my husband. Like, he really has a way of looking differently at things, and this can be a real pain. Also, like, for the team sometimes, and also for, like, the partnership, because, I mean, like, it comes with certain risks, including, like, where to put things in the kitchen. Like, if you look at it completely differently, you just don't get the system. So that's a different thing. But I think for me, what always helps me is to take out the seriousness of the thing. Like, if I kind of think, okay, we have a thing here, or we have a problem here, and I kind of take it very seriously, and I feel very responsible, and we have to solve this, then I just, I kind of get very tense in it. So time pressure, everything like that all kind of takes out that juice you were talking about, kind of, that's how it feels like. But kind of bringing in some playfulness, like not taking yourself seriously, not taking the consequences seriously, like to kind of, it's kind of like a childish approach, but something that I also felt while traveling, kind of like, okay, so the future, I will face it when it comes, kind of that kind of thing. That really helps to kind of come up suddenly, with a tiny new idea here, and then something there, and then, it kind of comes together. Yeah. And especially if you're in a room with other people or in a team working, then I think kind of bringing in this kind of silliness, like kind of like starting to joke about this thing, that thing, and kind of not taking ourselves seriously, like, I'm not the boss, you're not, that person or that expert, but to kind of really, try to bring in this lightness. Like, that's really helping, I think.
Okay, right. Emma, how do you introduce? Are you playful around other types of materials and objects when you see them, when you're traveling?
There is really a lot to say about this question.
Yeah.
I would say if I want to put into question a specific object, I would start to think about the broader picture. For instance, this is a glass, and we don't question it. But what if this would be designed by thinking about dust first? How would you design a glass if you have in mind a question about dust? Could dust create architectural effects on glasses? Would we collect them upside down or on a side? I mean, we take so much things for granted, and generally the way I go, it's like observing the object and asking myself, how was this made? Who made it? On whom could this production process have an impact? Which species, which populations, where in the world? So questions about the, let's say, material cycles on one hand, and also the, I mean, everything that we have around has necessarily ecological, social, geopolitical aspects that are embedded in it. So by questioning the broader picture, I train my thinking about, okay, how could it be? Or how can this may be done differently? If I do it this way, which needs can it answer, and which other needs could it instead, like, you know, satisfy or discourage, demotivate? Also, demotivating is a very big topic, like how can you nudge people not to do certain things? And I want to just come back a little about the second question you asked, which was about the aha moment.
Oh, yeah.
So I want to very much demystify the aha moment, because I think it's not even the most important moment of the process. I have personally 3 moments. One is like the which is I have a question, I don't know how to answer. The second is the which is I have a question, I'm sensing the directions of the answers, and then there is the aha, I know how to answer. And it's very interesting because they are really uncontrollable. I can tell you that, for instance, I have a tendency to have more aha moments when I'm wide awake or when I observe people doing things. As it happened in Thailand, often like, oh, this is how they do it, this is why this happens. But I think the and the are also super important in the process itself.
Oh, right. And so I imagine that what you're doing is, because you're taking in a lot of new information during that, your curiosity is driving you, right? When you're doing this, And I really like that you talked about kind of this playfulness, and that your observations is that when you're working in the workplace with the team, that allows better collaboration, right? And I mean, certainly from a neuroscientist point of view, from the neuroscience angle, we know that the human brain, if you stimulate the brain to be in a playful or in a curious space, the brain naturally produces its own kind of chemical fertilizer. So it's one of my favorite molecules. It's called brain-derived neurotrophic factor, so it's BDNF. So the brain, once you start playing, once the brain senses that there's something curious happening, the more you play, the more that the brain actually releases this chemical into our systems and stimulates the growth of our own nervous systems and brains. And so it increases neural synthesis of new cells. It increases the branching. Every cell, neuronal cell, has tens of thousands of connections. So it increases the number of connections that are happening between nerve cells, and it reduces cell death. So it's like a miracle chemical, and you don't have to buy it. You can actually produce it yourself, but you have to be playful. So isn't that like a wonderful remit to, there's a license to play. And as adults, we don't play enough. We're not playful enough, but we could the more we play, the more that our brains would actually be open to new ideas and new ways of thinking. So I think that feels a little bit like a nice segue to an invitation to the audience to be playful, because we've set up a little interactive exercise, which we'll pursue for about 20 minutes or so. My esteemed colleagues, I believe, are going to go and join with the audience. And what we'd like you to do is to please, and those of you who are watching at home, because I know our session is being recorded, so feel free to listen to the instructions and try this at home. So what I would ask you to do is find a partner. So work with a second person, hopefully and preferably somebody you don't even know very well. And what I would do is that one person in the group will be person A. So person A, what you need to do is think of a favorite hobby that you do, or an activity that you like doing, or maybe you like playing with your cat, or maybe you like cooking. So that's what the first person in the group will be silently thinking. The other person will think of a climate change problem. So we're going to be both serious and silly. So I would suggest climate change problems such as sea level rise. Maybe that's the big problem your group will tackle, or pollution. Do you have suggestions?
I'm thinking of so many right
now. Yes, exactly. There are many. Glacial melt,
yes.
You know, how to help with how do you stop polar bears dying? So, I mean, there are many, unfortunately,
yes,
right?
Unfortunately.
So is that clear? The second person in the group, think of a climate problem. Don't tell your other friend. Okay, so I'll give you a minute, I'll tell the time, and so you're each going to do that, okay? So please find a partner, and one of you is A, one of you is B. You decide, yes, it's random. Okay, right. So let's see. I'd love to hear from what I did notice, first of all, sitting up here, is I noticed how many big smiles I saw and a lot of laughter. So that makes me very happy as a brain activist, because now I know that you've all got a little bit younger, your brains have got a little bit more healthy, thanks to coming to the Futurium today and being playful and having a chance to explore. And there's not so many times as an adult that we get so many chances. So I'm very happy that your brain health is now better. But let's see what kind of solution we've had, and you know, whether or not we have solved the world's problems today is not important so much as just sharing some of the fun ideas we had. So does anyone have I'd love to hear a few examples. So yes, somebody put their hands up. Oh, thank you, the lady in the front. Yes, you're great. We have mics coming around. Thank you. If you could tell which problem and which activity you were working with.
Yeah, so the problem was natural catastrophe insurance. So it's a really big problem for home insurers, because natural catastrophes are coming much more frequently than before. So a once in a 50-year flood is now coming once every 5 years type thing. And then how do insurance companies essentially insure against those catastrophes? And we see entire areas where insurance companies are leaving, like Florida, California, because of fire risk and flood risk and so forth. So so how do we live without insurance in a 2-degree world or a 4-degree world or whatever? And then the Wouter was talking about how he is loving fermenting. So then we decided to go through how to do fermentation. So what is the fermentation process? And then out of that we came up with an idea that, well, you don't ferment things in direct sunlight. So maybe don't build a building in a floodplain anymore and build buildings in fire zones. So maybe don't rebuild. And then the other thing we were talking about is ingredients and letting them sit on the shelf and grow scobies and things that we were thinking about growing, and then we started thinking about trees and how trees are natural flood prevention. If you build trees next to rivers, they create meanders that don't exist in straight rivers, and straight rivers flood more easily than meandering rivers. So we were thinking about like growing and rewilding and how that could be natural flood protection. So that was
fantastic. And so you did come up with solutions. So lovely. Thank you for sharing. Who else? We can have serious, we can have silly. It's all good.
Okay, hi. So we had 3 people chipping in, and our problem was basically the coral reefs dying. And the other 2 parts were she loves photography and she loves music. Dancing. Sorry, dancing. So then we just thought of...
and could you repeat the problem again? So it was dancing.
Coral reefs dying. Coral reefs underwater.
Yes, coral reefs dying. Yes.
And photography and dance. And then we were thinking about how we can use these forms of art and how they can sort of nudge the coral reefs into this world of photography and dance and rhythm, and use that to actually grow them back. Like, you know, if we showed them different photos and how they would color the coral reefs back, or the rhythms of dance would help them sort of grow. So you're thinking about solutions on those ends.
Fascinating. Yeah. Fascinating. Thank you. Yeah, great. There's a challenge. Let's see. Perhaps on this side. Wonderful. Thank you.
So we had same problem, like flood.
Yes.
And I like to juggle. So we thought about a method of like using balls maybe to prevent water coming to us, or maybe using clubs beneath the buildings. So then when the water gets high, so the buildings will go high with them. And when they go down with them. And if we collect a lot of balls, we can fill them with water. So we will find balls all over the place, so we can all juggle and don't see the water anymore.
But I love, what a wonderful image, the juggling building, right? The building moving up and down.
That
Fantastic.
would be really nice.
Yeah, it would be very nice, yes. And
we're
the dancing
creative.
coral reefs. Yeah. Yes, and maybe another, please. Yeah. There's.
Oh, hi.
Hi.
The 2 of us were talking about painting. So painting with the help of hair, painting pigments, painting expressionist forms. And I was thinking air pollution. When I'm in India, I live under a dome in winter with a lot of Feinstaub, a lot of microparticles. And right now I'm doing the very same thing in Berlin. So when we added that together, suddenly the desire to make it more three-dimensional, the painting, and looking at factories with air pollution, and creating holograms which make people feel the painting became very real. And I started thinking about last week's Fashion Week, and new fibers absorbing ultraviolet rays, and maybe geometric patterns which give us an alert when what is coming from above gets too toxic or slightly irritating, and we should go inside and have a deep breathe. We get a little bit of a color change. So we become like angry chameleons.
Yes, angry
that don't
chameleons.
want to fit in.
Wow.
And then and then we were thinking about giving back something like chlorophyll. And finally, I went on a spin, and I didn't even tell you yet. I was thinking of us as walking trees giving back something to our environment. The moment we move, our fabric sort of gives something back to the polluted air. So still on a spin, the 2 of us.
Wonderful. Wow, this is so great. Really, what an inventive audience. There's a group here. Thank you.
So the problem was habitat loss, so biodiversity loss and just like land loss or ecosystem loss. And my hobby is silk acrobatics.
Sorry?
Aerial acrobatics.
Oh, aerial acrobatics, okay.
So we thought of how to place them in a way that they simulate temporally, like a jungle or a forest for the species that rely on like trees. And then also use them as ropes to then grow algae and then recreate like ecosystems in the oceans, or hold together like the Arctic kind of like so that the ice or the icebergs do not leave, so that protecting the polar bears, so that they have space to live and they're not
yes.
so threatened.
Yeah.
So yeah, I think it's
So
a pretty clever solution.
Using the ropes from
Yes.
your acrobatics that gave you that
Yes.
idea, the equipment.
To keep the Arctic together.
Yeah, thank you. Fantastic. So, is there anyone else? Yeah, there's a group here.
Hi. Yeah, we can quickly share. So I just wanted to share Selena's very creative thing that she does is, so her and her best friend make like merch for each other's anniversaries, right? And so the other day they made each other like a t-shirt and a sweater where they designed a logo and created like a phrase, and they made like a really nice design. And so that was her creative thing. And then I just saw news the other day from Lithuania, because I'm from there, that the climate scientists are predicting that the temperatures are actually going to go down by 5 degrees. And that was something that was very curious to us, because we always assume that temperatures are going up everywhere, but actually it's a northern country and it's going down. So we just kind of played around, you know, thinking it was a silly solution, but it was about how can we maybe create like merch where we can communicate this. And then we thought maybe we can communicate this to like local communities where people don't even believe in climate change, or maybe they're against it, and how can we create like these silly marketing materials where we can convince them of this. Was there anything else that you wanted to add?
Do you want to add the crazy bit?
Oh, add the crazy bit.
Right.
Always.
We also thought about infiltrating a party of climate change deniers and giving them goodie bags with these fun facts, right? Like if imagine finding in a goodie bag a pin that says temperatures are going up by 5 degrees, climate, researchers say, and they're like, haha, posting it on Instagram. It's not real, you see. But actually it is. So then by making those statements, it would mean that they actually are understanding climate change correctly.
Okay. Right.
That's one thing.
Yeah. It's very playful. That was excellent. Thank you. Wonderful. So thank you all. I think you all should be applauding yourselves. So let's... Thank you. Thank you for being willing to try that out and to experiment. And it's really wonderful to see what we were able to produce, to think of just in 10 minutes with a stranger, right? And this is very much part of some of the things I do with, when as a neuroscientist consulting, but, trying to get, if you look for the first solution, it's not always the best. But if you can keep pushing and pushing and pushing and go into some crazy zone, that's when you often see some really brilliant ideas and innovations coming. So lots of other exercises where one can stimulate one's brain in this way. But let's get back to the discussion. So I'd like to invite my colleagues to come back and rejoin me on the stage, please. And I encourage all of you, when you go home, to sit and, give yourself a challenge problem and sit and try and do it. Try and find 10 answers, 10 different solutions. And there's something also about putting together two very different ideas and topics, push them together, and this stimulates the brain to sometimes find radical new ideas. So it's just a good practice to do at home. So I was wondering whether you two had any tips or ideas about, we've been doing this in our social space, helping each other's brains, being a little bit playful about thinking about climate solutions. And both of you, I know, have thought so much about climate solutions, regenerative economies. How could we create worlds and social spaces in which all of us could be trying to kind of think more about the future, right? Because it really needs many, many more people pulling together now that, the world is such a complex place. How could we create spaces that would be not just like tonight for a few minutes, but do you have any ideas, or from your own experiences, things that you've seen work in other communities?
I think the key is starting to care, and as such is challenging, but at the same time it's the process that I think starts with teaching each other skills and knowledge and talk openly about things we go through also. And by also growing this kind of empathy, we can start noticing dynamics or noticing how, not only people evolve or ourselves, so in more introspective ways, but I would say also the more we learn about the environment we live in. For example, if I start knowing which plants can be edible, which plants can be used for health promotion, I cannot unsee them when I walk through Berlin, through the parks, and they are there growing. And it's a practice of relationality. So I think we have to learn how to relate to others and to relate to our environment, try to learn about the other species and ask ourselves more questions. Why is this like this? Why are the linden trees not creating this sticky, horrible patina around all the city anymore? Like 2 years ago, I think everyone experienced this phase in which no one, like there were even some cars that were impossible to open for the stickiness. I called it sticky season. And last year it was not like that. Why did it not happen, for instance? By the way, the stickiness comes from a parasite that eats the sugar inside the leaves and then they poop it out.
I see.
So when you go under the trees and you feel a sort of strange rain is actually parasite poop.
Parasite.
I'm sure you were all asking yourselves, what the heck is this? Now you know. Yeah. So coming back to your question, which I partially forgot in the anecdote, how can we create more regenerative futures? I think, the key question is really to stop ignoring things, stop ghosting things and people.
And I think we live in a time of terrible anxiety and stress. So I think part of this is to be able to give ourselves agency again. So we may not be able to help with the big system. Each one of us can't maybe tackle the big problem. But to realize that we can empower ourselves by changing how we playfully think about each object. Because the more we do that, somewhere in there, we are thinking of new ideas. We might stimulate somebody else. By us being playful, they may be the one who goes away and has this radical new idea. So we are like a meshed mycelium, right? We're not really so much individuals, but we can spread this attitude of playful exploration if more of us are doing it. Yeah, I mean, Anna I see you nodding. What are your thoughts on like these? How do we create more spaces and communities where we can encourage this?
I wish I really had an answer to this. I only have questions, because I think one key definitely lies in collaboration. I mean, as we saw in this game here now, like if you think about something by yourself, it's always limited. So if you start talking to other people, if they bring in their perspectives, it becomes like immediately a much richer environment. So yes, collaboration is one very important thing, and for me also playful collaboration is also key. And that's something that, for example, in a workplace, it's very hard to keep that, and it's very hard to, that it's maybe easy to create a certain space in which you can keep this, but work is also tedious, and you have conflicts, and it's stressful, and you have deadlines. So it's kind of like always working against that and just kind of creating these spaces in which it's possible. And within the larger public, I also feel that we always want a lot from like ourselves, from each other. It's like, okay, the world is going to shit, like, come on, let's do something. And it's like, how much can we do, right? Like sometimes it's like thinking about how could we counter this. I mean, we have also we have created an economic system in which it's less and less diverse. Like it always goes towards, the few companies that have all the power. Like you open up a niche. For example, the internet was such a niche, then you have a lot of diversity, and then it's, it's kind of like going towards a monopoly again, or the big players. But bringing up the energy to counter that is so, it's so immense. I mean, we are all more, right? We can decide, but to bring this, to bring in dynamics into this lethargic group that we are, and that we are also allowed to be, right? I mean, we can't fight all these big problems. So somehow it's also sometimes I think, okay, I would love to be part of a collaborative platform of creating a very different way of looking at supply chains, at regenerative agriculture, sourcing materials in a different way, helping each other. There's a lot of synergies between food and fashion, for example, and you can bring in a lot of things, and as long as it's a very diverse space, I think it's also a very rich space. Yeah. But to create that takes so much energy that sometimes it's just, it's very difficult to start, and it's very difficult, everyone has their own ideas, and then kind of you run yourself tired. I've been trying to do this for a few years, and it's kind of, you really feel like, okay, how much can we actually do? And yet, I think then when you come together in a group, such as this even tonight here, and you talk to each other, that's the moment where I think I can also draw energy and optimism. And I think that's what we need to do. We need to create spaces in which we see each other, we talk to each other, we play with each other.
Right.
To just, continue.
Yeah, and Emma, I think I remember we've chatted in the past a little bit about kind of an emotional resilience, right? How critical that is if you are, like yourself, an innovator, an entrepreneur. Could you tell us a little bit more about your thoughts or your experience as somebody who's dedicated to innovation? How important and critical is that emotional side of life?
Well, you cannot be a good innovator if you don't have a very strong support network, which means, as Anna said, networks take a lot to build. And I think in most of the cases, it's about really committing to finding your people. And all this kind of also Instagram psychotherapy of, water only, who waters you, and stuff, which is kind of, I'm half joking because I think at the end is very true. So you cannot innovate enough if you are brain fogged, if you have exhaustion, if you are not taking a break, if you are staying the whole winter in Berlin. Yes. So I think it's very important on one hand to really commit to try to behave in ways that you would like to receive on one hand, and on the other hand, also really work on yourself, grow emotional, social intelligence. We cannot expect only external input, and of course innovation, it's also a matter of right constellations. So I would say, on one hand, find the people in your private spheres that really support you and genuinely help and are there. On the other hand, it is important to look for the people who professionally see the value of our work, the value of our vision, and try to resonate with that. I think this was essential also in the past. I was very lucky to find people who really supported me incredibly, and I really committed, and I commit still, to really nourish those relationships, which means having convivial time together. If you see something very specific, buy that present. It's like really showing that we have this humane side. We need attention, we need affection, we need attentiveness, and these are all levels that are essential in the most neglected form of sustainability, which is personal.
Yeah. Thank you for those reflections. And one of the things that strikes me, I mean, you've both mentioned this kind of the resilience, but the anxiety, and right now we're living at a time that not only are these huge complex problems happening and the need for solutions, but we're also it's impossible, it's practically impossible to avoid being bombarded by news headlines in so many countries that are very anxiety-inducing, and partly it's the reality of what's happening in the world, partly it's the way in which news is being delivered to us. So we are in a kind of, certainly neuroscientists are particularly concerned looking at how the brains of the population are really entering into an extremely agitated state. And as Gabby mentioned when she introduced me, so I led the research at Center for Humane Technology in the middle of Silicon Valley, looking at how people are being manipulated into a threat state. If you're manipulated into a threat state, two things happen at least. One, your brain becomes a little bit more open and vulnerable to buying more things, to hooking into that system, to being a consumer because you're scared and worried, and so you eat more, you buy more. There are whole kinds of addiction patterns that are created, intentionally or not. I'll leave that to another discussion. But the other problem that happens is that a brain that goes into a threat state, you can actually see this in the laboratory, you can brain scan people, rather than a brain that has certain types of alpha waves, very broad, open kind of ideas, able to pull ideas from many different spaces. The minute you start becoming anxious or stressed, or you're bombarded with lots of information, let's say, 15 minutes of online shopping, where you're being bombarded by a lot of information, can radically change your brainwaves, and it particularly affects the brainwaves that we associate with creativity. So rather than big picture thinking, rather than thinking, and I don't just mean creativity such as painting and the arts, but also the idea to innovate, right? And to be able to think about big systems. Instead of being able to look at ecology and how different countries might connect, or how the boots I buy affects somebody else's life, that type of big systems thinking, the brain shuts down and we start focusing on tiny, tiny details. So we can actually see that after 15 minutes of online shopping. So that when we are empowered by this knowledge, then we can start making our decisions as to, this is my brain, don't touch it. I want to have the ability to think big. I want to be able to flourish and be creative if I wish. But first, it helps to have the knowledge of how to protect your own brain so that you can be innovative if you wish, or creative, and how to protect our communities, right? And also, you mentioned talking to others, being with others. I think in the past you've told me that there are DIY groups that meet. Is that right? Is that the right name?
Yeah, DIY is right, do it yourself.
But groups, is that right? Or fabrication?
I would say there are more meeting points, which are called, for example, Fab Lab, Fabrication Labs.
Fab Lab, okay.
That are basically spaces that look a bit like workshops with tools and spaces for working with different materials. So it's possible to do stuff from like your own piece of furniture to electronic circuits and 3D printing. Some of them have also like sewing machines and stuff. And I think it's very important to have the spaces because they foster community and collective approaches, which is something that it's kind of a bit dying out. So it's not anymore like in maybe the last century, in which, for example, there were villages in which families would gather and make together, I don't know, like tomato sauce, or maybe there would be a group of people repairing their own clothes or baking bread together. And I think everyone is suffering because of these things, and I still think that we are still witnessing the impact of the isolation of COVID times, because now it seems like probably a decade ago, but I still think that probably that time is still impacting us psychologically. This is my perception.
No, I think we have data on this too, And speaking of community, we'd love to open it up, I think, to the audience for your questions to our panelists. So we're going to bring a mic around. Yes.
Hello, thank you. That was very insightful. I actually have a question. It's more like to sort of get your thoughts on something, because I think in terms of just thinking of raw materials, I think individually we have this distance to any sort of raw material, whether it's tissue papers we use or packaging. And I think I'm a designer myself, and recently have been very interested in material research and regenerative design, etc. So I'm actually interested in hearing your thoughts about how we can use design to make people more aware, or sort of bridge that distance that any individual has to any sort of material that we use, whether it's books, our clothes, paper, and yeah.
I think we've come, as you said, like we've come so far from the origin very often, right? Like whatever material we have, we change it, we work on it, we put chemicals into it, we, you know, change it to a place where it's no longer even recognizable what it was originally or where it came from, or it is really an artificial material that, you know, never, I mean, that also has an origin, obviously, but that's even further away from something that we can see in nature or experience or touch or anything. So I think like honest design, kind of showing where things come from, leaving them as untouched as possible, like going back to, you know, the original color and leaving it that way, not bleaching it, not coloring it, not dyeing it. And also being honest as to a natural material is never perfect. There's always something. And I think that's something that we need to learn again, to see and to accept, and to like not see as, you know, faulty or there's something wrong with it. So I think that's also something that, as like, you know, everyone who's working in design can actually kind of help get us a bit more, like a bit closer back to the origins of the materials.
Yeah, I totally agree with Anna. I think, well, it depends. It depends a lot on the context, because one thing is studying, one thing is university, one thing is like the real world, and the real world is much tougher because policies, and policies means that specific materials are somehow bailed out ongoingly, because also, I mean, bailed out within the industries that produce them and so on. The point is, if you want to create aware consumers or aware citizens, you have to revolutionize a bit the education system. And this is a massive, 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 massive change in which I don't particularly trust. And this is just to say the realistic situation is that, for example, industries are not paying for the disposal of their packaging or their products, because who is paying that? It's us. And this is very convenient. And this means that new materials that have a huge potential, as the material with which I'm working for almost 10 years, do not even have space to make a difference, because there are missing facilities, there is, let's say, then it's also a question like, do we want these things to be produced in mass? I think this is probably a question you also had in your company. So like, what is the right scale to still claim to be sustainable, regenerative, and so on? It gets really tricky. So the point is, as long as policies are not making companies polluting the earth mostly accountable for what they're doing, we can try our best on our individual level, but I don't think that the big change is going to happen bottom up. Would be my utopic hope, but I think for the scale of things, it's very hard. This doesn't mean that we should not be accountable for our actions. So just saying. But yeah, I think what design can do is try to convey in ways in which people can really get the value and the meaning you want to express. Like, there is a lot of material research at the moment, and there are many samples of different materials done in DIY ways. But the problem is often that everyone does the same things. Everyone makes cups, everyone makes lampshades, everyone makes, let me think. Straws, you know, always the same thing. And can we think a bit beyond?
Yeah, yeah.
Like, we are trying to force new materials in replacing materials that already exist without trying to really learn the personality of the new material. If I have something that is super hydrophilic, like cotton, but it's another source, let's say it's called, I don't know now, pinko. Why am I forcing this super hydrophilic, which means it absorbs a lot of water, substance, to be resistant against water? It's not its essence. And this is also a topic that it's at the very core of my research group of now, Methods of Activity, which is exactly about trying to understand the material as it is, as its inherent properties and its inherent agency, and start from there instead of like taking something that maybe just resembles another material and forcing it into it, because then you have to cover it with like synthetic coatings, stuff that it's super hard to recycle. You're making maybe an organic substance into something that it's not organic anymore, and it's impossible to recycle because there is no system that can take care of that. So I would say, on one hand, be very honest about the design, try to not force materials into what they're not, and this is just one part of our process, and I know that as designers we hate when people think we are stylists, because we are not. Design is much more, and I'm not going to talk about this now because it would be too long, but just to say that it is very important how we deliver things. If we want to propose a new material, it needs to look aesthetically acceptable, especially from the point of view of the people who are going to ideally welcome your proposal. So if we are in Berlin, Germany, you have to think about what would people in Berlin, Germany find acceptable. Maybe you have a specific target, maybe it's like, it depends on the context, but you have to really imagine the multi-scale aspects of why, how, where, when, who, and so on. But now I don't want to talk more.
I'll add a little thing to that as to the question of what designers can do. You know, you have power to help us see things differently. So before you even invent new materials, this question of the materials we have, you know, as my colleagues both said, we tend to not see what is the past of the glass. We, as a species, our time frame is very limited, and the ability to think more long term, so that if there are ways to create playful exercises or create commercial advertisements or campaigns where you ask the question, you know, a simple, present an exercise, they get given any object, can you think about it 5 years, you know, what was the last 5 years of this material? And it becomes like a, you know, popular thing that people do. It's a natural question. So designers could be part of that kind of activist campaign of helping us rethink, you know, once we start questioning things, once we all start questioning what's the last 5 years of that object's history. And here at the Futurium, you know, I know that there's a lot of work. How do we think about time? Why do we also not think about the future? What is the next 5 years of this object, right? That should just be a reflex. So let's take another question. We've got a few minutes. Yeah.
Hi, thank you very much. My name is Mateen. I have a question, and it is, have we lost our connection to materials, or are we gaining so much materials so we don't feel the connection anymore in terms of data and digitalization? So before, we used to read a book, we have a material in the hand, we feel it, we can smell it, it's really nice. I also remember some books I read, like how they look like on the shelf. But now I don't even remember the names of the books I maybe read. So is it material, or do we see the digital world as a material? Yeah, maybe the phone is a material, but some stuff inside are these materials for us humans?
Yeah. Is this a question for you, Perini?
It could be.
Yes.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah,
So you're asking if I understood you correctly, are you asking that is it because that our ability to think about materials has become kind of in a way over flooded because we are given so much choice? So yes, absolutely. The informational overload, human brains are not built for vast repertoire. So we see less if more is not better. Right? And the information technology in the era sold us a false god, as it were, that we will give you the whole world, and actually people now know less and can navigate information less because we've been over-flooded. And how do we then take action and power back? I've always been, I'm fascinated by what happens. Certain types of poetry, very old-fashioned traditional art, is the idea of certain poems can describe an object by using metaphors or analogies in a way that makes you see it completely differently, right? So it could also be it's like a literary yoga. You're twisting your brain into new shapes and sizes because the metaphor in the poem makes you look differently. Not every poem or poet, but certain poets. So Thomas Tranströmer, the Swedish poet, he once described the red cabin sitting in the woods like a bouillon cube, a stock cube, the brown stock cube. Is that, what would it be in German? But the stock cube.
Suppenwürfel.
That word. But this is a house, but sitting next to the lake. And since then, I keep, every time I see one of those little Swedish red houses, I think about this soup. And, so this practice of poetry is there. You can, practice it, train your brain. But ourselves, not just poetry, but to take that bigger idea of to sit, it's a type of meditation, right? A mindfulness about whatever object it is. So I'm so glad that you brought that question up, to really look and feel and smell and think about whatever that object is. That I think it was it Newton, Isaac Newton, that said that the trick to science was to be able to look at a grain of sand, to see the universe in a grain of sand. So that ability to open our minds up when a lot of the world we've been designed into is forcing us to do this. So thank you for the question.
And also, if I can just add a tiny thing to this, because I've really felt what you said, like our world is so full in a certain way, and it's become so poor in experiencing the world and with every other sense, right, than just, seeing something or getting all this information. And I also see this with our kids. I really feel that loss of just go out, just be in the forest and feel and hear and sense the world differently. Yeah. So going into a supply chain, going into the origin, into the soil, into where does this actually come from? That's such a rich experience, and I think we just need to look for this very actively.
Right. So I think we're rapidly coming to a close for the most formal
last question. I think she had a last question.
Oh, okay. Yes, you're holding the mic. Okay. Yeah.
Okay. Thanks so much. I'm wondering how you think about growth, particularly in the context of raw materials. One thing that's true is that they're limited. So listening to both of you talking, when it comes to your product, do you put yourself a limit, and do you actually impose yourself a limit and say, well, actually, there's only so many sheep they can have, and therefore there's only so many shoes that I can create, and therefore there will only be so many shoes I will produce and so many customers I will satisfy. And in the same way, when you travel to a different part of the world and you observe the plants that grow there and the ways of using those materials, do you say, yes, we come from the outside to learn and extract the knowledge, but we don't attempt to recreate it or extrapolate in a way that is not mindful of the local raw materials that are there?
Yeah, yes, I mean, definitely. I mean, raw materials of a certain kind are limited and they limit what we can offer. So this is inherent in how we create the supply chain. And yet, like wanting to do everything differently, like already, you know, building up a supply chain is taking so much energy of the organization and so much money that we need to put into this, that we're also extremely limiting ourselves on the other end, up to a point where we can actually not survive. Because what I said before, that there's less and less diversity, so there's more and more pressure onto, for example, like regular advertisement and marketing, paid marketing. So we spend all our money in the beginning of the whole process. Like we spend all our money in the supply chain. And then we don't have money left to pay for marketing. And that way we are slowly but surely actually dying. Like the company is kind of going down because we're not spending that money. So we're doing work that then others can go have a much cheaper product but just pay a lot more for marketing, and they will eventually sell more than we do. So this, within that system that we're building, like that decision is making us like slowly go bankrupt. And if we don't change the framework of the economic system in which we're working, we won't be able to keep this up. So that's where we stand.
Okay, and thank you very much for your question, because it addresses one point that it's really in the heart of my project, which is that I said I did fieldwork in Crete and Thailand, because in both cases, on one hand, like in Crete, it was more about the this medicinal plants. There is very specific reason why Crete was chosen, which is a relational reason, especially because my supervisor, my microbiology supervisor, has half of the family in Crete. So she approaches her research by also relating to this country with which she's like personally connected. So I went there to explore these plants that she already chose for her own research. So when I talk about relationality and research and trying to be regenerative and sustainable, I want to mention also this German say, which is schützen durch Nutzen, and this means protecting by using, which means that if I know that something can have specific benefits on one hand, because like it fosters cross-generational connection by learning with different generations about what was important, what still carries specific meaning, specific senses of belonging, which are all aspects that are incredibly important for humans, then it makes sense to also find an excuse to get to this knowledge. So you're protecting the knowledge by also making it evolve together with contemporary biotechnologies. And this is a bit of a complex answer to explain the part about Crete. The part about Thailand, it's kind of funny, because on one hand, it puts me in a pretty embarrassing situation, because I went to Thailand thinking they have a very super specific technique, that it's unique in the whole world, and I am the first one going to write about it because there is no literature in English and in European languages about this. And I found out that the technique is basically the same that my grandma uses for her vinegars. So when I went there, I had the aha moment of like, oh, uh-huh. And it was not an aha, it was more an uh-huh. But for me, what was incredibly interesting to see in Thailand was more how people relate to organisms that are present in their environment, and through this intention of like using specific plants to create, for example, probiotic fertilizers for this specific reason. It's like, for me, it was super inspiring to see they have 7 tastes, and the tastes mean basically how you can use different plants to make fertilizer with specific purposes. For example, there is the bitter, which is used for example, how do you say, to discourage insects to attack your plants. Or there is the spicy, which is very useful for molds. So they have this system based on tastes and very specific plants that grow only there. So they relate to their environment by also observing where these plants are growing, how the things change throughout the year. And I was already very aware that, for example, I would never use durian, mangosteen, and you know, all the specific plants that they have there. And I'm also not reusing the system of tastes, because this is something that is specific to their knowledge. What is important and interesting for me here in Berlin is to start noticing which plants are growing in Berlin. I already made some experiments, for example, with rosehip, with sandorn in English, I forgot. Or is it English?
Sandorn?
Yeah.
I don't know in English.
Anyway, it's a sort of orange, juicy, small fruit. Stingy nettle and linden flowers, which are all growing in Berlin, and I'm doing my experiments to understand, for example, how to grow more biodiverse materials with plants that grow around, also to train my art of noticing. And at the end, the whole point of relating to biodiversity is also to find out regenerative methods that allow us to adapt to climate change. So if I know which plants are growing and how the organisms are changing through the decades, but I have a method that it's based on microorganisms that can adapt to many different things, then climate change is not so scary, because I can adapt the production with the plants. And again, then the question is which scale of production, small, mass, and so on. But my research of now is just focusing on, it's more on a base level. So I worked in applications before, now it's more learning from science, from the field, how to maybe relate in new ways locally. So my focus now is in Brandenburg, and I'm working with fermenters and also with a botanical garden with whom I'm learning about local plants.
Right.
So yeah, no extractivism in this sense is foreseen, but it's also a process.
Yeah. Oh, what an inspiring end to the really lovely evening. Thank you very much, and do come up and chat to us. Okay.
Thank you.